Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
Mother by Aakash Sharma. Evil lurks all around us. It may be disguised as the smallest of sins, taking root in the lives of many, only to manifest itself in horrifying ways. I know of evil because I've spent my life around it, even worshipped it, and born of it. This is my scary story, one I lived and experienced. And with every scary story, there are horrors in this as well. In fact, 2 of them. My father was one such evil. He used to be a happy man, or so I was told by my mother, but I never saw him as such. I think deep down sorrow had consumed him, a sorrow of some sort of anger, clawing at him from the inside, tearing at his soul. But the man he was, he resisted. The bottle was his aid, and it begun to consume him. A demon that helped keep his pain at bay, but took all of his warmth and love away. He was not a bad man. Never did he walk home drunk and stir up violence in our little house. He never raised a hand on Mother, neither on me or my baby sister Gemma. What he lacked was, as I said, warmth and compassion. He never looked at us like his family. Rather, he had a manner that suggested he felt us to be his captors, and he was our prisoner. He never looked any of us in the eye, never dared even touch any of us. I missed the loving pat of my father's hand on my shoulder, telling me that I did good. Gemma never had a daddy who brought her little affectionate gifts, or a father who would console her when the other girls poked at her, calling her names and little insults for something she could never change about herself. The stuttering wasn't natural, my mother told me. The poor girl had probably hit herself on the head, and she was too young to remember it. At the time I believed it, but now I'm not so sure. Growing up in a small village, people had some funny ways about them. I had to take up the role my father never did and walk around with my sister, making sure no one made my baby sister feel bad about herself. My only other friend in town was a kid named Jack. He was around 15, almost a year younger than myself at the time, but he was a good kid. He never got into trouble, that is, because he was never caught. He was smart about his ways, sneaking into where he shouldn't be, and almost never getting himself caught. He told me once about how he had overheard Mr. Keats and his wife fooling around in the woods by the creek. At the time, it happened to be my favorite story that I'd heard him tell me. That's why I remember it so well. But then there were other stories he told me. Another one I remember was about the McCleary girls, talking about sex near Stern's old mill. It sounded exciting, but I remember it being a rather disappointing story. One day I remember Jack had told me that he spotted my mum near the old creek, sitting by herself, her head resting on her crossed arms. She looked sad, Jack told me, and patted me on the back, giving me a sympathetic look. I pretended that I hadn't known about it, but I did. My mother was a very sad woman, but being a woman in those old days, she didn't deal with her pain like my father, who was being slowly consumed by the bottle. Instead, she liked to sit alone at times, with her only thoughts to keep her company, hoping that her feelings would be taken away from her by the hand of Mother Nature and something did hear her. Only it wasn't Mother Nature. It was a bizarre day at the farm. Sheila the cow wouldn't let me near her today. Every time I approached her, she would panic and start making weird grunting sounds while grinding her teeth. I passed it off as being sick and went on to check on the pigs, but they weren't right either. They were all tucked up together in the corner of their little sty, as if they were cold. One of our hens, Bella, had smashed all her eggs, and the other hens kept away from her, while she ran up and down the small shed. It was such a big racket down there that I was afraid that it would cause trouble. Sheila, our cow, and that wouldn't be well for her health. And there was, unfortunately, nothing I could think of to do about it. So I left them be. My father was the only person I knew who could handle this. He owned the whole farm, for goodness sake, so I went up to him before I went to bed. He was lying face down on the table. His eyes were fixated on a lamp my mother had set there, slowly pulling the string, lighting it, then pulling it again, turning it off. "The hens are spooked. Thought I should let you know," I said, looking down at him on the table with crossed arms. "Yeah, all right," he replied, his gaze still taken by the lamp. After that, I went up to my room and lay on my bed to sleep the rest of the night off, thinking about everything my mind could give me. I thought about the things that made me the happiest as a little boy. The McCleary sisters. I had a little thing for them, even though they were much older than myself, and both of them already had boyfriends. Jeanette McCleary was the one I specially had a thing for. How my cheeks flushed with red to think of her with her pretty red hair, blue eyes, and nice firm breasts. I was in love the day I first saw her, and even though I was equally mesmerized by her sister Josie McCleary, Jeanette was the first sister I had interacted with when she asked me for my name for the church choir, which I gladly told her, but refused the invitation. The last thing I wanted was to embarrass myself in front of our little town. Then my thoughts shifted to my mother, and then about the awkward conversation, if you could call it that, with my father. I felt my lips frown when I thought about him. I really wished that I had at least some kind of fatherly relationship with him, or at least have him behave like a human being for once. I closed my eyes and started to pray, as my mother had instructed me to do each night before bed. But this time, I included a little prayer for my family to be whole, to have more love and be closer. I was awoken by the sounds of tapping on my window. There was a raging storm outside, and my young mind, even though burdened with responsibilities at the time, was still not yet brave enough to brush it off as something plausible. I imagined the worst, standing out there, waiting for me to look at it. "Look at it," my mind told me. "No," I mumbled to myself. "Look at it. If you close your eyes, it will come closer," my mind told me again. "It's just the rain," I told myself. But my thoughts wouldn't leave me alone. "If it's just the rain, why don't you look at it?" My mind taunted me this time. "Fine. Just one quick peek," I told myself. And just there. It isn't the first time I saw it, or rather, its horns, as it made its way away from my window and to the front door. I was paralyzed in fear of what I had just witnessed. 2 round horns curled backward. I couldn't make out the color. It was too dark out there to realize that. There was a knock on the front door, and I was snapped out of my trance. Whatever it was, it had come to the front door. I knew that if I was going to answer it, it would punish me. Punish me for ignoring its call at the window. My mouth began to run dry, and more than anything right now, I wanted to scream for help, but I couldn't move. My heart fell when I watched my baby sister Gemma walk out of her room and walk down the stairs step by step, dragging her little blanket behind her. I screamed at her not to open the door. I threw myself at her and even cried out loud until my voice broke. But I was trapped in a prison of my own flesh and body. My fear had distanced my mind from my body, and in that moment, I felt dread like never before. Watching Gemma move, it was like she was sleepwalking. Gemma never walked in her sleep before, and it was the last thing I expected her to do now. I finally got control over my body when I heard Gemma take the last step, after which I bolted out of bed and down the stairs, rushing behind Gemma, who had placed her hand on the doorknob, ready to pull it open. "Gem!" I let out a loud hush, taking hold of her hand. "Don't!" I pleaded with her. She pulled at the handle, turning the lock open and slowly pulling the door. There, standing out in the pouring rain, was a tall, strange figure. It had 2 horns like a goat, strangely shaped limbs resting on hooves, and covered in a thick coat of white fur. It walked in slowly, its feet hitting the ground, ringing with a clamp with each step as it got further inside our home, shaking itself dry while it stood. Its eyes shone bright, a bright yellow, very ominous, with a glaze that chilled my spine. It extended a hand out to Emma, who grabbed the hooved thing and escorted it upstairs in her sleepy state. I followed them, too afraid to say anything, too afraid to get myself hurt, but I couldn't leave Gemma alone with this thing in our house. I walked up to what used to be my parents' room, which was nowadays only occupied by my mum. The thing stopped there and knocked its hooved knock at the door, a sound that would come to haunt me for my life. I heard Mum sit upright in bed with the sound of a creak and watched our shadows be illuminated by the yellow light emerging from the bedside lamp in my mother's room. "Who is it?" my mother asked, still probably half asleep. "Gemma?" she added. The beast opened the door slowly, offering the other empty hand for me to hold, which I fearfully obliged. Gemma was still asleep through all of this, and I was thankful that she was. I could only imagine how frightened the poor girl would be with this presence in our house. The thing pushed the door open after temporarily vacating one hand from Gemma's grip and walked into the room. My mother looked at it wide-eyed, and I took the time to notice its appearance in the light as well. It was a goat, or appeared like one. Everything about it matched a goat, from the low-hanging ears to the rounded horns. "You called me," it said in a bizarre voice, as if it spoke through multiple tongues of many men and women at once. "Here I am," it finished. My mother let out a scream. She couldn't control herself. She kept screaming and screaming until she passed out on the bed, falling off the bed, dropping the lamp simultaneously. "Go to bed, children. We shall speak in the morning," it said to me and my sister, seeing us both to our rooms, then shutting the door behind it. That wasn't the end of it. I heard the sounds of its hooves walking down the stairs. A clap for each step. I knew immediately where I was going. I wasn't that stupid. My father was probably downstairs, probably drinking or doing God knows what. oblivious to the fact that a monster just came into our house, was coming straight towards him. I heard a slight shuffle downstairs, bracing myself for my father's terrified screams as he laid his eyes on the monstrosity. But there was nothing. Nothing at all. Just some faint conversation. My father, I thought, was probably too drunk to understand the situation. I pressed my ear down on the floor, trying to listen to what was being said, but there was abrupt silence as soon as I did. I feared that the thing knew I was listening, and I would climb back up to let me know. So I hurried to my bed and buried myself under the blanket, all the while clasping my hands together and mumbling nonsense that was meant to be a prayer. I do not really know how long it had been, but time had passed so slowly, with a swarm of the worst outcome of this night plaguing my head. The front door opened and I watched my father walk out of there, the demon following it as he went, shutting the door behind. I battled with my thoughts, a part of me telling me to follow behind, another part telling me to stay in bed with my eyes shut. Waking up the next day and telling myself that it was nothing but a bad dream. I wasn't bold enough to investigate, so I decided to stay in bed instead. Eventually, my tiredness took hold and pulled me into the world of dreamless sleep. My life wasn't the same after that, and I think it never would be again. The demon lurked in the fields all day, just floating around the crops like a specter. As it wailed the entire way, my mother would spend her days just sitting in her bedroom and weeping, sobbing uncontrollably, with my father going up there occasionally in an effort to console her, which never seemed to work. She used to cry and cry all the time, never leaving her room to look at us. Gemma wasn't supposed to be out of her room. She used to sit there all day, singing songs to herself and sleeping through most of the day. I felt sorry for her. Even tried to walk in there to be with her once to ensure she wasn't lonely, but my father wouldn't let me. This was the first time he spoke to me like his child. He told me it was for my own good that I don't speak to Gemma, and not to worry about my mum either. He had put a leash on his drinking these days, and for once I was grateful for anything the demon brought with itself. I even considered that it might not have been a demon at all. Perhaps an angel. One evening when my father had gone up to my mother's room to console her, seemingly endless crying, I sat in front of the house, watching the being hover around the fields. I made a stupid move then. I decided to go to it, perhaps speak with it. I wanted to know more about this thing. I watched its white fur-coated body and horns hover around the tall wheats, its lower body concealed by the crop, and stood up. I'd made up my mind. I made my way to the fields, and the being hovered over the fields like an aimless ghost, or perhaps even some kind of guardian. It realized my presence there, and I knew that it did because I watched the tall crop shift as it made its way towards me. "Who are you?" I asked, my lips twisting into a smile. I felt like whatever this was, it was an angel sent here to fix this broken family. "Mother," it replied with the same low voice of many men and women alike, as if lost souls wandering inside its body. "Are you an angel, Mother?" I asked, feeling strangely about my question. The way I felt about this being started to change as I felt the air change, becoming colder by the second. "I come from another place, child. A place where angels go to get their wings torn, where the damned scream and sinners burn. it said with some indifference in all the voices it spoke with. Are you a demon then? I asked. To some, it said. Do you want to see where I come from? It said, lowering its head to face me. It didn't even wait for a response, rather just bent down to stare into my eyes, its ominous yellow eyes reflecting my face. Look, it said, this time with a hint of excitement in its voice. Jake, no! I heard my father as he grabbed me and pulled me away. His face was glistening with sweat and his breathing had been heavier. My dad put his hand over my shoulder, a fatherly, protective touch that I'd never felt before from this man, and led me away from the fields. His gaze fixated on Mother, the demon standing in the fields, who watched us leave silently. I don't want you in them fields, boy. Stay out of this, he said. Yes, Pa, I complied. When I was back in the house, I wept. I felt grief like I never did before. I can't explain it, but I felt a feeling of loss along with fear. I was on the floor, my arms crossed around my body until I was finished. My father had headed straight up to my mother's room. I went up the stairs and pressed my ear on the door. I felt like maybe this would provide me some insight into whatever the hell was going on. Please, Arthur, make it go away. I don't want her to go. It was my mother's voice. Who was she talking about? Don't do this, Marie. You know we cannot do anything about it. The crops will die. A famine will come. We are the only thing keeping this town alive, my father said. We already did something unspeakable once. Don't you remember, Emma? Don't you feel anything about her? You swore that you'd kill it for me. You swore, Arthur. You swore. Marie, why do we have to do this every time? Do you want the boy to go too? The godless thing almost took him, my father said. My stomach felt weak. I was trying desperately to connect the pattern here, but that only got me closer to a conclusion that I didn't like. And yes, I did swear, but you know what that thing is capable of. You know what it can do. If I die, the town dies too. You know, my father continued in a more repressed tone. I heard a hard smack which startled me. You are a coward, Arthur. Forget you! I'd never heard my mother speak this way, certainly not with my father. I heard someone approach the door and I ran back to my room, shutting the door behind me. It was another sleepless night. I didn't want anything to happen to Gemma, and from what I gathered, they were going to take Gemma away. I had to do something. I knew I had to. I didn't want to be a coward, standing by as my sister was taken to wherever the demon took it. I snuck out through the back door. I knew where I was supposed to go, to whom I had to meet. Jack was quick to act when the rock hit his window. I watched the kid climb down like a squirrel to the grass below. He hadn't seen me for a while. He couldn't get to meet me either because my father patrolled the house all day. I told him about everything from the demon, my mother, and Gemma. I don't know if he believed me at that moment or not. But he knew I was serious about Gemma being in trouble, so he knew he had to help me. We need, holy water and a cross, he said. Probably some silver as well, he added. That's how demons are handled, I guess. Well, okay then, where do we find them? I didn't care much about any of this. I was desperate. I can get the cross, and my mother has a silver chain I could get from the house, but I don't know how we get the holy water. Doesn't it need to be blessed? He said. We do it ourselves, I think. Just get the cross and the silver. We'll figure it out. Jack and I made our way to my house, making sure to sneak in without being caught. I knew my father wasn't asleep. But what made me more nervous was that I couldn't spot him anywhere either. Jack was excited for our little mission, but as soon as he laid eyes upon the hovering being in the field, he started to have second thoughts, I could tell. Anyway, me and Jack made our way to it, knowing not what to do. "Shit," Jack said suddenly, slightly startling me. "What?" I asked him. "We forgot the holy water," he said. "Let's go get it." I realized he was right. I didn't know how to use the tiny 1-inch crucifix or the silver bracelet, but I did have a few ideas about the water. I had presumed that a tiny sprinkle would probably make the demon burst into flames or something like that. So in my eyes, that was a pretty powerful weapon. As we turned back to leave, my heart stopped as I saw Mother standing there, facing down at us. Jack let out a scream. He hadn't seen the thing this close before. It bent its head to Jack and stared at him with his yellow eyes. I sprung into action and pulled out the cross from my pocket, and in front of the creature repeated the only words of prayer I knew, which made me realize how unprepared I was. "By the power of Christ, I compel you to go back to hell, demon," I said, feeling less of a man with every second of silence that followed. The demon stood upright and looked at the dark, starry sky, letting out a low grumble, then turning back to us and starting to chant in a whisper. It seemed like nothing but nonsense, but the whispers kept going on and on. I felt dizzier every whisper, with the sound seeming to come from all around me, but I also feeling like nothing but silence at the same time. I heard another voice begin to chant, and to my horror I realized it was Jack. He chanted alongside the demon, his voice growing and trembling uncontrollably as his eyes poured with tears. I could tell he wasn't doing this willingly, and it was hurting him, hurting his throat as he continued whispering in that chant louder and louder. The demon then stopped and looked me in the eye, its eyes now flaming red like hot coals. "Impure blood, 12 years, it said to me, wrapping its arms around Jack, who still chanted. I shut my eyes, shielding them from the bright light that emerged, only to open them to find Jack was gone. I looked all around. Jack was nowhere to be found. The skies roared. It was going to rain again. I didn't know what else to do but go back to my room. I felt an awful silence follow me as I went up the stairs and into my room, shutting the door behind me. I felt whispers in the air as I sat on my bed. This would be a sleepless night. I didn't know whether to accept this as a bad dream or feel guilty about my friend's loss. I knocked on my mother's door. I waited for her answer. Impure blood. What did it mean by that? I kept thinking to myself as my dad opened the door to my mother's room. Then he went back to sit on his seat beside the bed where my mother lay. He had a half-empty glass in his hand. My mother was fast asleep. He stared at me with those blue eyes of his, running his fingers through his red hair, asking me if I was okay. He called me towards him, seating me down in his lap and running his fingers through my hair. He glanced at my sleeping mother, her red hair covering her face, her eyes shut as she went to sleep after a hard day of tears running through those blue eyes of hers. Impure blood. The words still rang in my head. I had a bad dream, I told my father. Impure blood. He ruffled my blonde hair as he spoke. So did I, kid. So did I. So quoth this raven. Thank you to Aakash, Sharma, for this lovely story. And thank you all for coming to visit me in my library. Sunday, I will put up a bit of a longer video with the sole purpose of reading you all to sleep. A new thing I'm going to try, bedtime with Madame, and see if you all like it. I know many people listen to narrators as they go to sleep, myself included. So we'll see how this goes. I think I'm going to start with a story from M.R. James. We'll see you then, and special thanks to my Patreon supporters, Ermin, Darren and Jennifer, Laura, Mutant Artificial Intelligence, Tabby Cat, and of course, Charlotte Emerson. If you like this, please hit the little button to let me know. If you didn't, hit the little button to let me know. Leave a comment. I'm always glad to talk with you, my darlings. I'm open to suggestions and criticisms, critiques. If you have not subscribed, please do so and ring the little bell so you know when to come up and see me. And I will talk to you next time, my darlings. Farewell.